Hello, everyone. Wow. Oh, God. Like I'm loud, but this is on another level sometimes through the microphone. How are you all? Welcome, welcome. My name's Laila. I'm a software engineer and solutions architect. I work for a company called Particular Software, where we build in-service bus. And many, many years ago, I think almost like a decade ago, we were living in this sort of small but beautiful house. And I really loved it because it was super easy and fast to clean. So I was a happy person. But then as we started to grow our family and everything, the amount of spring cleanings that I had to do to get the house in order, it started to increase. The amount of stuff that I was able to get rid of as part of the spring cleaning, that just shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And at some point, we kind of had to admit that we had outgrown the house. It was really it wasn't working for us anymore. Now, when we started looking for a house, we had this beautiful vision of, we're going to find this big place, and it's going to have an amazing garden, and, the kids will be able to play outside, and my husband will be cooking at the barbecue, and I will make my summer paellas. It's going to be lovely. All forgetting about the fact that in Belgium, we don't get summers. But anyway, we still sort of pursued this vision, and at some point we found this house that we really fell in love with, which means that we also had to sort of find a mortgage, right? Now, one of the things that my parents really instilled in me is that when you buy something that is significant, you don't just go to the first option and you just buy that. No, you are going to compare. Right? Because especially for a mortgage, when you look at all of these different rates that they offer you, and there's just this tiny fraction of difference, well, over 20 years, that kind of accumulates, and it can make a huge, huge difference. Now, what you end up doing, basically, is that you end up going to different banks, right? Entering every bank over again is like, yes, I want to buy this house. Yes, I would like to loan maybe 500,000 euros. I would like to get this over 20 years, blah, blah, blah. Same story everywhere. So it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of energy. You can do that, or you can use a loan broker. Who knows this example from Gregor Hoffi's enterprise integration patterns? A few hands. Okay. So basically the idea is that this is a system that does exactly that for you. You go to them and you tell them this is what I want, and they're going to take care of actually reaching out to all of those banks. So what happens is that as a customer, I come in and I make a loan request. And I say, again, 500,000 euros, 20 years, please help me out. And I would like a fixed rate because, the market's a little crazy right now. Before they do anything for me, they're like, okay, payment, please, because, nothing in life comes for free, right? When that's done, and I've paid for the service, then can you hear me through this thing? This is annoying me. Okay. So then they will do a credit scoring calculation. Why? Well, because they want to sort of figure out whether I'm a solvable customer, right? Whether I'm safe to loan money to, but also because we want to understand what type of customer you are. For example, we will have banks that only work with premium customers or that only work with entrepreneurs, for example. At that point, we will get our eligible banks because some of the banks only want to loan money to entrepreneurs or to premium customers. We will send out these requests for an offer to all of the eligible banks, and then some of them will respond to us with an offer, and some of them won't. Now, of course, every freaking bank has their own API format, their own data format, so we'll have to sort of do a translation effort to be able to understand that data within the context of our own loan broker application. With all of the offers that we have, we can then say, let's try to rank these results and see what the best offer is. And that doesn't only depend on the rate, but usually all the small letters that you haven't usually read. And when we have that, we can finally present the best offer to our customer. So given that there's sufficient complexity involved here, I started to think about, okay, this actually could benefit from a microservice architecture. Why? Well, because a microservices architecture is comprehensible, and it's autonomous, and it's easier to maintain, and oh yes, it makes decoupling so much easier, right? It gives us that flexibility and resilience, and did I forget any of the magic words? Anyway, when you think of a microservices architecture, you can think of it as sort of like one of these dots on the screen. Each microservice is small, it's concise, it's easy to understand, and easy to change, therefore, right? But the thing is that one microservice doesn't really give you any meaningful business value. The business value we only get when we put all of these things together. When they start to communicate with each other, then we can build a systems that our users actually can get some value from. So when you think about it, yes, an individual service is simple and easy to understand, but we haven't really made the complexity go away. We have just moved it. Where? Well, to all of that inter-service communication. The way that all of these services communicate with each other, what they exchange with each other, and what they do with each other, that's where the complexity goes. Now, if we can all sort of agree that this is where the complexity goes, to that inter-service communication, well, then we need to pay more attention to how we design all of those lines in between. Because this becomes especially important when we have more complicated workflows where we have multiple services that are interacting in order to fulfill one of our business processes in our domain. So let's say that there's sufficient complexity in there that we need some kind of a coordination mechanism. Then how would we go about this? Well, as you might expect, if you come to this talk, there's two coordination mechanisms we'll talk about today: orchestration and choreography. Now, when you think of orchestration, it's sort of a command-driven approach, right? There's a central component that is directing the flow, that knows exactly how the process is behaving, and that will also manage all of the state that pertains to that process to make decisions on what needs to happen and when that should happen. That's why we tend to refer to it as a state machine. So, it keeps all of that state around in order to enable that decision-making and becomes sort of like your main source of truth of where we are in that process flow. The way that it does that is by sending commands to other services, telling them what to do, not necessarily telling them how to do things, right? It doesn't have inside knowledge on those implementation details, but it will command those individual services what to do. In a choreographed approach, on the other hand, we have an event-driven approach. We are more sort of reacting to things that are happening in the system. There is no central component that is sort of driving the entire process flow. Instead, what happens is that the state is now scattered across all of these services that participate in that workflow. Each individual service taking care of the state that actually belongs to its own internal service boundary. Individual services will therefore also decide what to do and when to do it by subscribing to business meaningful events and just reacting, and then maybe as a result of what they do, they end up also publishing another business meaningful event. Yes? So this is the only theory we're going to see today, because I actually believe it's a lot more useful to look at some use cases to try and understand what the real differences are, which is what brings me back to our loan broker. Let's consider that to get this started, we are going to design this with an orchestrated approach. That could take us to something like this. So our user comes in and says, yes, this is my request, right? What we're then going to do is instantiate an orchestrator. That's one instance per one workflow instance, if you will. We're going to get our payment, right? That's the first thing that we do. And once we have that, we will say, okay, let's do some credit scoring. We will ask our quoting service to get us all of the eligible banks, and then we will send out those requests again. Once we have all of those quotes, and we've received them and translated them and all that, then we can ask our ranking service to sort of put things together for us. And this looks great, right, at first sight. I mean, it's pretty simple, easy to understand, and we have our state managed by the orchestrator, and it's easy to understand what the process flow is. We can just go into that orchestrator component and try to figure out what's going on. But as you might expect, there are some downsides to this approach as well. First of all, ask yourself, what happens if one of those services becomes unavailable? Okay, credit scoring died. What now? Well, now our orchestrator components needs to care about these things. It has to introduce resilience patterns like retries and backoff mechanisms and stuff like that, right? It's also going to have to care about what if our credit scoring becomes available for a couple of days? What do I then do? Another thing that stands out to me in this picture is the high amount of coupling that we see in the orchestrator. Right? It's coupled to all of these downstream services. It has knowledge about all of them. Another thing that stands out is that there can be a high amount of contention. What does that mean? It basically means that there can be a lot of communication between all of the downstream services and the orchestrator component. Now, the more communication that you have going back and forth, the more pressure that puts on the orchestrator, and that's when we need to start thinking about scalability. Okay, what if I need to scale my orchestrator? Well, if we have multiple instances, we probably want all of the communication that pertains to a single workflow instance to go to the same orchestrator instance service as well. And then it starts to become more complicated, right? And it's all sort of issues like these that can sort of expose our orchestrator as this single point of failure. Because if that thing stops working, well, the entire workflow is now stuck. We can't move forward or backwards, right? Everything is just stalled. And if you even consider what would happen if we wanted to add a step to this workflow, well, let's see. Let's say that, for example, I want to add this invoicing component because people are paying us. This is so annoying. People are paying us, so they also want some kind of an invoice for the payment that they did, right? Now, at this point, it's not sufficient to introduce an invoicing component. Instead, what needs to happen is that we need to change the orchestrator to now also communicate with that invoicing component. So to add a step, you are now changing two components. And sometimes another thing that we also see is that the orchestrator has access to all of these downstream services. So when we need to add something, it can sometimes look easy to add more stuff into that. And that can tend to become monolithic as well. Holy bananas. I mean, that's a lot of trade-offs. Like, that's a lot of downsides that we need to consider. That's a lot of things that we need to keep in the back of our mind when we're using this approach. Maybe choreography is going to magically solve all of these problems for us. Let's take a look. Now, this is the exact same flow that we have talked about. It's going to look very different visually because we have moved from that command-driven approach to an event-driven approach. So now what would happen is that payments would publish an event, say, oh, I got paid for this service, right? At that point, credit scoring will be interested to that and say, okay, I'm going to now do the scoring, publish an event. Quoting will be interested in that credit scoring that happened. And then, once it has its quotes published, ranking is subscribed to that, it can rank the stuff and then publish that again. Yes? Makes sense? This kind of addresses all of the downsides that we saw earlier. Remember that we had a high amount of coupling, right? But now there's no central component anymore that is linked to any downstream services. Scalability, as we talked about, well, easy peasy. If ranking is suffering, we just give it a little bit more juice, scale that out, scale that up, whatever makes sense, and then we would be good to go, right? So the whole idea of having a single component that is now the single point of failure, well, there is none. Now, another thing that we also discussed is adding a step, right? If we want to add now our invoicing step, easy peasy. We can just add a subscription to say, oh, when a payment is done, I'm going to generate an invoice. So adding steps to our workflows can become trivially easy. Yes, everyone with me? Okay. When we start to look at what we gain, we see, okay, we don't have that temporal coupling. Why? Because now we have an event bus. So we are not expecting any of these underlying services to be available. If one of them is down, well, fine. The messages will be waiting on the broker. Yes? There's also no central component anymore that's coupled to downstream services, no complex scaling scenarios, no control coupling. There's no one component telling other components what to do. And adding steps is easy. And for me, one thing stands out to me when I look at that list. There's almost no coupling anymore, right? So when we start to look at these coordination mechanisms in terms of coupling, then we can start to see that, oh, orchestration gives us a high amount of coupling. Whereas choreography, well, that seems to give us a very low amount of coupling. Would you agree? Yes? No? I can see a lot of people nodding. Well, there's one big flaw in this assumption. I didn't talk about what type of coupling. Now, one of my friends is Italian, and if I would walk to him and say, wow, these are all spoons with a combination of water and flour and eggs, and therefore it is all the same, well, probably he wouldn't be my friend anymore. And that is exactly how we need to look at coupling as well. Because just like all of these different types of pasta serve completely different types of meals, we have different type of coupling to consider in our system that introduce different type of friction, different type of sort of trade-offs that we need to concern ourselves about. Now, if we look at the sort of most basic types of coupling, we have afferent and efferent coupling. Who's heard of that before? Okay, a couple of hands. Well, this was first introduced with object-oriented programming as a way to sort of measure coupling in between sort of objects that we are using. But we can still use the same categorization of coupling to also describe the coupling between our services in a more microservice or service-based type of environment. Now, afferent coupling refers to all of the incoming coupling, all of the incoming connections to your service, all of the other services that therefore depend on you, right? Whereas for efferent or outgoing coupling, we are talking about all of the outgoing connections, all of the services that you call and therefore depend on. When we try to sort of circle this back to our coordination mechanisms, then we can see that in a choreographed approach, we see a lot of incoming or afferent coupling. Because when you have a component, well, that has multiple subscriptions to the events it's emitting. Whereas in an orchestrated approach, we see a lot of outgoing connections, right? We have that orchestrator, lots of arrows going out of there. The reason that I'm drawing this picture is because there is still coupling. The only thing we have really done is that we have inversed the direction of coupling. Basically, the arrow is still there, it's just going in the opposite direction, okay? Now, it's interesting because when you read about asynchronous communication and messaging and event buses and all that jazz, you read a lot around the world decoupling. Oh, decoupled systems and decoupled this and decoupled that. And the thing is that, again, we are not always being very explicit about the type of coupling that we refer to. Because you can most definitely build a message or an event-based system that is super highly coupled. That is your distributed ball of mud, right? It's not that it makes the coupling magically disappear. There is one piece of truth to this, is it removes one type of coupling. And what type of coupling is that? Does anyone know? Temporal coupling. Yes, exactly. That is the real decoupling that we get out of the box when we get asynchronous communication. Because now we don't expect that component to be live and running when we do something. There's a message going into a queue, and when that component is available, it will be able to process that. I'm wondering if I should just take this off and speak very loud. Better? Oh my God, what a relief. Okay, so another thing that stands out to me as I started to research orchestration and choreography is that there's this sort of misconception, or this assumption, if you will, that if you are using an orchestrated approach, by definition, you're using synchronous communication. But why do people sometimes think that, right? Because we are really talking about different things. When we talk about request response, we have one component calling another component and waiting, basically performing this blocking operation until that other component processes the request and basically sends back the result. This is a blocking operation. When we do this in asynchronous communication, we are maybe sending a message, right? And then that's it. We move on with our life. This other component can then take on that message, process it, and it will be handled out of band. It will be handled on a separate thread. But why do we necessarily have to orchestrate with synchronous communication? We don't. We could perfectly use asynchronous communication in an orchestrated approach. We could even use synchronous communication in a choreographed approach as well. And if you want to learn a little bit more about all of these different types of combinations, then I would definitely recommend this book, as it takes a whole chapter, or possibly even two, to go into all of the different combinations and talks through all of the pros and cons. So yes, using asynchronous communication with an orchestrated approach is a perfect option. So let's take a look at how that would look like. Now, we've seen this flow before. One of the things that you're going to see in this picture is so many more arrows. It took me so much effort to draw this in PowerPoint, like it's no joke. The reason that we have so many more arrows is because the communication is asynchronous. So sending a message to payments is one way. The response from payments to the orchestrator, that's another message, right? It's a reply, which means that it's a different message going in the opposite direction, just routed back to the sender, if you will. Now, in this situation, we have solved some of the sort of downsides that we had in our synchronous orchestrated approach, which means that our orchestrator is not necessarily dependent on any of these downstream services to be available. We are now using the message broker in the middle to deal with that. Now, of course, there can still be a high amount of contention, lots of back and forth, right? Even more, if you will, because the communication is basically now exploding a little bit with the back and forth. But that is fine, because we can scale that a lot easier with the queue in the middle. And if something breaks up there, if the orchestrator for some reason goes down, we are not going to lose any requests because they are safely stored on the broker until it becomes available again. Now, we still have that command and contract coupling. We still have the orchestrator telling all of these underlying services what to do, although it's not necessarily dictating how to do it. And how much you put in that contract can also sort of expose how much of that command coupling you really have. We are still communicating through contracts, which will also be the case in a choreographed approach anyway. So you will have that sort of data contract coupling, if you will, in both of the approaches. So at this point, the idea of the orchestrator being a single point of failure, not so much anymore, right? Another thing that I want you to consider is the coloring of the arrows. In this case, the blue arrows represent commands, and the white arrows represent basically that reply that I said that's going back to the originator, back to the orchestrator in this approach. But there's another design decision that you need to make at this point. And what exactly is that? Well, that credit scoring component, or any of them, can basically make the decision to reply with the results to the orchestrator, or it could publish an event. Because maybe credit scoring wants to make some of that information known to the rest of the system. There may be another component actually interested in those results. Or for example, in our payments, because when a payment is made, there might be an accounting service or whatever other service that is interested in the fact that that happened. So it might be useful to publish an event there as well. And finally, for our ranking, when we rank all of these offers, it could be useful to make that known to the wider system so that we can do other things with that information. So whenever you have this type of an approach, there's still the difference in design decision that you have to make, like, do I just want to execute the command and send back a reply to the orchestrator, or do I want to publish an event? And this is where you need to start thinking about public versus private data. Because the orchestrator is already commanding you what to do. Maybe it's fine to sort of share a little bit more information with that component because it is directing the flow. But do you really want to expose all of that information to the rest of the system? Not necessarily. As we all know from using social media, once you make data public, there's no real way of making it private again, right? And the same is true for your systems. It becomes really hard to take that data away because other subsystems may start to depend on that. The point is that you need to make an intentional decision about what you want to do here. And in many cases, it can actually be useful to reply to the orchestrator with more information and to actually then also, in addition, publish an event that makes it known to the system what just happened while sharing a lot less of information. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, sometimes I explain this flow to people, and they're like, but wait a second. You have told me that orchestration is a command-driven approach, and you are now publishing events, right? But the thing is, it is still an orchestrated approach because we still have that central component. It's still managing all of the state of the workflow. It is still deciding what to do and when to do it. It is still sort of the owner of the process flow. So therefore, still orchestration, even though we're using events. So let's recap where we have arrived with this asynchronous orchestrated approach. Because at this point, we have removed temporal coupling, even if we're using orchestration, because we're using an asynchronous method by putting a message broker in the middle. We have also, therefore, regained our flexibility in scaling, because we can just scale our consumers out, and we have multiple services that would be sort of consuming events from the same queue, or messages from the same queue. We still have that contract coupling, which, as I mentioned, we will have in a choreographed approach anyway. Anywhere in your system where you have two components communicating with each other in one way or another will be coupled by contract. That's what's going over the wire. We also still have control coupling. We still have this sort of central component that is telling other components what to do. Now, the upside of that is that visualizes the process flow. Now we have basically separated the process flow from the implementation of each individual step, right? That gives us a single component to go to if we want to understand what is happening inside this flow. We can start to reason about these things more easily. And finally, our state is centralized. And this is really helpful because it gives us a lot of visibility into where are we in this process flow. Like if I have an order to fulfill, where am I stuck? Where is my order right now? It would be a lot easier to have a central component to go to understand that, as opposed to having to query 5, 6, 7 services. So, which one is better? Anyone? No idea? Or trick question, right? Now, the thing is, I haven't really enabled you to answer that question because we haven't looked at the drawbacks that a choreographed approach would introduce. So let's take a moment to do that. And I'm going to introduce a different flow to do that. Now, if at some point we're like, okay, we found the best possible option, I am ready to commit myself to paying off this mortgage. Not entirely sure, but yeah, I love the house. At that point, we would accept the offer, and there's a whole new flow that starts inside the bank's domain. And having worked at a Belgian bank for 5 years on this domain, there's 1 or 2 things that I can tell you about how that would look like. Basically, it starts by accepting the offer, right? At that point, we are going to redo an ID check and a credit check. Yes, the loan broker already did that, but we're going to trust but verify, right? Once that is done, you are going to sign documents until you're like, what am I signing here again? Yeah, like it's a rope around your neck. That's what a mortgage is, right? Now, at that point, we're also going to link a repayment account. This is the account from which you're going to pay off the loan. Now, this is not so simple. The bank's actually going to verify, do you have an account with us? Is there an incoming stream of money coming into that account? Have you linked that for your salary? Basically, they want to be sure that you're going to be able to pay this off. Then we will create our loan, and as part of that, we will calculate some interest provisions. Now, as you may know, when you get a loan, the monthly payment that you have, a part of that is capital, a part of that is interest. The interest is what the bank makes, but what is interesting is what they do with that. Part of it they will set aside to deal with like bad debtors, like people who are not able to repay their loans. Another part, they will basically reinvest. That's exactly what those provisionings are. It's like getting an understanding of what are we going to put aside and in what way. Another thing we're going to do is set up a direct debit order on that repayment account so that the money is coming off your account automatically. Another thing that will happen is we will pay out that mortgage, 500,000 euros, for example, directly to the notary. Because you will never see that money on your account, not even a split second. There's this intermediate party that will oversee the sale or the acquisition, depending on how you look at it, and then we'll get the money to the party that has earned it, if you will. And only when you have a finalized deed, which again takes around 100 pages of signing again, then those documents will be scanned in the bank, and once they have them, they will say, okay, now we can start the loan, and the repayments can start. Yes? If we take this on with a choreographed approach, like I said, the quote is accepted. The identification service will subscribe to that and do an ID check. When that is done, our credit scoring check will happen, right? And then when the credit scoring is done, loans is subscribed to that, we'll then we'll take care of signing all those documents and set up the payment to the notary, also set up that direct debit, and finally do those interest provisions. Let's consider the downsides of this approach. Now, the first one I want to talk about is business failures. And I'm specifically saying business failures and not technical failures because they're very different things, right? Technical failures we want to tackle with resilience patterns. Business failures are basically like these alternate flows that are outside of the happy path, still part of the business. Now, the thing is that you get into these scenarios when things don't really go as expected. Now, let's assume that I arrive at the notary super excited. Yes, we're going to buy this beautiful house. And then they're like, oh, we are so sorry, but the seller's back out. So this is not really going to happen. Now, what's our problem at this point? Who has the money? Yeah, the notary has the money. So that means that the notary now has to refund that money to the bank, right? That needs to go in the opposite direction. In addition, those interest provisions that we calculated, yeah, they're not really relevant anymore because this is not going to happen. We also need to cancel that direct debit. I mean, I'm definitely not going to pay off a loan if I didn't get the house, right? I'd be very pissed off. What you really need to look at here is how many arrows are you adding in the reverse direction? Let's go back to our flow. So to implement something like that, right, we would basically have payments now publishing an event that the money is back. Loans would now be subscribed to that. This is where we can see bidirectional coupling, because previously, loans was already subscribed to payments was already subscribed to an event that was published by loans. But now we're doing the reverse, right? Now loans is subscribed to an event that came from payments. Once that is done, it can publish an event that the loan is canceled, and then provisioning and banking can subscribe to that and then do their part. That's pretty neat. But what you want to look out for is how many of these arrows are you introducing in the opposite direction? Because if you want to undo part of the things that you just did because things didn't go as expected, and that ends up creating 5 additional hops back in your system, probably that's a lot more complexity than what you thought initially. Now, I like to sort of compare these less than happy flows with knitting. That's one of my hobbies. I find it really relaxing to do. And sometimes I make mistakes, right? And sometimes that means dropping a stitch. Sometimes that's like, whew, I'm going to have to unravel part of it. But it's almost never the case that I have to unravel the entire thing and now start over. And the same is what we see in our systems, right? Our compensating flows are these alternate flows beyond our happy path. And we have some of the actions that we did that now need to be undone. But it rarely means that we need to return all the way to the initial state. Usually, to implement these types of compensating flows, we will see that the same services that got us here to begin with will also be involved in undoing some of that thing. Makes sense, right? So it's important to be aware of what are all of my alternate flows that can happen in my business and how much bidirectional coupling would they be introducing if I do this in a choreographed way. Another thing to consider is our passive-aggressive publishers. Now, I always like to explain this with a story because, it sticks. My husband is usually the one who cooks at home, and I really, really appreciate him for that. That gives me the opportunity to be with the kids and help them with their homework and all that. But given that that's a lot of effort, we have this kind of agreement that, okay, if he's going to cook, then I'm going to clean up the kitchen. Only fair, right? But there are some of these days that I swear I enter the kitchen and I'm like, what happened? Did you use every pot and pan that we had in the house? Really? It's like the whole thing just exploded, tomato sauce everywhere. And Now at that point, I could say, I'm going to publish an event to state that the kitchen is messy. And that's only fair, right? I mean, it's a state that the system has arrived to. Kitchen is now a mess. And I'm just stating a fact. But as you can already foresee, there's a bit of a problem with the type of the event I'm emitting. It's my expectations. Because first of all, I expect that he's listening to me, which is already tricky. Second of all, I expect him to take action, to get up and come and help me out and clean this mess that we now have in the kitchen. Now, I think we can all agree that that type of communication, not really good for your relationship, right? Well, guess what? It is not really good for your systems either. Let's take a look at an example. Now, in this scenario, we have our banking component that is subscribed to that document signed event. What was it going to do here? Set up that direct debit, the fact that the money's going to come off our account every month, right? But this is passive-aggressive communication. Why? Because from a loans perspective, the publisher, it needs the direct debit to be set up. Because otherwise, we'll never get our money, right? The loan will never be able to progress unless we have the direct debit set up. Now, at this point, when you see this type of thing, and it can be like very sort of almost like invisible sometimes. It's hard to sometimes see it. But when you find this, it is important that you ask yourself two things. If loans cares that much about setting up this direct debit thing, then maybe that should actually be a responsibility of the loan service boundary. Loans should take care of it. Why is it asking another service to do something, right? Or if you're like, no. I mean, setting up direct debits is a whole thing, and we have a dedicated service for that. Okay, fine. Then use command-driven communication. Make your intent clear. Hey, banking service, I need you to set up this direct debit. Hello, dear husband, can you please come and help me clean up the kitchen? It's very messy today. Yes, that works a lot better. Why? Because now, if there's no response from banking, we can deal with that. Or if something went wrong here, then loans can deal with that as well. Yes, so it's important to be very clear about our intent. But that's not even all. Are you still with me? Still awake? Yes? Okay. We have more to cover. Now, the thing is that we could also sometimes see changes. Let's consider a regulation change, right? As I said, we're doing an ID check and a credit scoring check before we give people money. But now they came and they said, you know what, from now on, I also want you to do a background check. And remember what we said about choreographed approaches? That it was easy to add steps, right? Because what we're going to do is just add a subscription there, and we'll be fine. Except there's an issue, because our loans component is subscribed to the credit scoring event. But now we've added this background check event that it needs to wait for, which means that now we need to change that subscription and add a subscription to the background check, right? And wait for that. But this actually made it 10 times worse. Why? Can someone see why? The thing is that now we have forced an order. Nobody told you that first you need to do a credit check and then you need to do a background check. The only thing your stakeholders told you is you need to do both. But by designing it this way, we're first going to do this and then going to do that. And you might be thinking, okay, it's totally fine. What you could do is just have loans subscribed to events from both credit scoring and background check, right? And yes, that is true. But what does that mean? Well, it means that now loans needs to keep track of, was credit scoring done? Was background scoring done? I need to have them both done. And what does that mean? I'm going to need to keep some state. Wait, what was state for again? Wasn't that what we were using in an orchestrated approach? Yes. This is what I tend to say, is when you have complex prerequisites like these, I need to do this and that before I can move on there, that's when you're looking at an orchestrated approach. But I'm not telling you to now throw the entire flow around and only use orchestration. It's important to also see, where do we need the orchestration? We just need it for this part. That doesn't mean we need it everywhere. One way to sort of go about this is to also ask yourself, how probable is it that we would see changes coming to our domain, right? So you want to find areas that are prone to change. One of the ways I've been going about this over the years is sort of practice finding anti-requirements, which really means nothing more than asking questions. Many questions, okay? So you're going to be asking your business stakeholders, is this a probable change? Could that possibly change? What are some of the ways in which you see the system evolve? Could it be that if we do this, would that change? And sometimes you will end up asking silly questions. And that means that sometimes you'll have a business stakeholder that looks at you and is like, do you even know what we're doing here? Like, of course not. And that's great, because they've just given you security that that thing that you just asked is not going to change. It was been to Barry's talk. He also talks about residuality theory, in which you can use these stressors to try to find and isolate things that might also be changing, right? It's also a really cool way to look at this. Now, if you see that there are plausible changes in a system, it does not mean that now by default you can't use choreography. I want you to be aware of those possible changes. I want you to evaluate the most plausible of those scenarios and try to apply them to your design and see how would that break things apart. How much bidirectional coupling would that introduce? How is this system, like, is it going to be able to survive those changes, or would it require us to change everything again? It's important that we are aware of the trade-offs that we are making when we make design decisions. Another thing that can be really tricky is versioning. Now, the thing is that in any type of a coordination mechanism, whether you're using choreography or orchestration, version is going to be hard. If you have to change a workflow, it's going to be difficult either way. But it's going to be orders of magnitude more complicated in a choreographed approach. Why? Because there is no workflow. Instead, what happens is that the workflow emerges from the flow of events that are going through your system, right? Emerging behavior. Who's heard that term before? Okay, a bunch of hands. Now, you need to now think, if I have existing workflows and we have this new change to our workflow, how is this going to affect the existing ones? How is this going to affect things that are in flight? Is this only applicable from a certain date? Is this only applicable for the new workflow instances? These are all things that can make things more complicated. And what I've tended to see is that versioning can end up affecting multiple services, where you have services that were previously completely unaware of the other ones. Now they're taking care of all these intricacies just due to the reason of versioning. Another sort of downside that we can sometimes see in a choreographed approach is the lack of overview. Because as the system grows and grows and we add more steps, it's like, I don't know what this workflow is doing. Like, I will just repeat that thing again. Emerging behavior, right? There is no workflow. There's no component that shows you exactly what is happening. You have to now map out all of these events that are happening, who's subscribing to that, and which events are like published as a result of that, and who is subscribing to those. And when systems grow and grow and grow, and we don't take care of the workflows and of their scope, it can sometimes start to feel like a pinball machine, where one event is published and it's like ding, 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 all over the system. What just happened here? It becomes really hard to understand what is going on. And this tends to lead to sort of 3 different points of friction, especially when you need to understand the state of the workflow. Oh, just give me a minute. I will go query the state of 5, 6, 7 different services and see what their state is, put everything together, reason about it, and I will tell you where we are. That's especially challenging when there's a bug in production. And there's this manager standing at your desk like, what's up? Like, what's the status? Like, you've been at this for a couple of hours. Yeah, sorry, I'm just event storming over what's possibly going to happen. Now, the thing is that when you see this in like larger teams, in the worst case scenarios, what you get is just teams pointing fingers at each other. We are fine. We just subscribe to that event, and from the context of our service, everything is fine. We just ended up publishing that event. And team A says that, and B says that, and C says that. And when a manager steps into an environment like that, and everyone's like, I didn't do it, what do you think they're going to say? Well, now everyone's responsible. Nobody's going home until we figure this out, right? If you're lucky, you can order pizza. How do you solve this? Well, first of all, by trying to reduce the complexity with all of the trade-offs we've talked about, but also observability, right? In these types of systems, you cannot afford to have to find out what happens and go and look into code. You want to have some kind of observability to be able to go to a tool, pull up the traces, and see what's going on. If you're interested in that topic, I've done multiple other talks about it, and there are other people speaking about this as well. So if you've never heard about that, definitely dive a little bit deeper there. Now, at this point, it could be like, why did I come to this talk? I am so much more confused. Like, this is most definitely how I felt when I started to look at these things, because it's like, it's impossible. Now, the thing is that the sort of question of orchestration versus choreography is the wrong question, because it is orchestration and choreography. The question is where, and the question is why. And the very annoying answer is that it depends, right? And you're like, come on, I came for answers, and yeah, now you're giving me this, it depends, like, thank you. So I want to send you home with a little bit more than that, because I've developed sort of this mini framework of a couple of questions that I will ask myself when I'm looking at a sort of design decision like this to sort of help me navigate the storm, if you will. And the first question that I will ask myself is, what type of communication is best suited for the workflow that we are looking at? Do we need synchronous communication, or do we need asynchronous communication? Now, if we're using synchronous communication, the odds are bigger that you end up with an orchestrated approach. If you're using asynchronous communication, well, then your options are wide open, and you will have to look at the other questions to try to come to a sort of well-suited solution. Now, as you can see, this is not a bit. It's not yes or no. It is a spectrum, right? And another thing I want to say is the answer to this question, it should be driven by your business requirements. Yes, there can be scalability concerns and resilience concerns that you want to take into account when you choose a type of communication, but even that should be driven by your business requirements. Okay, so talk to your stakeholders. Another question to ask yourself is, do I have complex prerequisites? Like, do I have these multiple things that need to happen in order to be able to do another thing? Because if that's the case, well, then you're more likely to benefit from an orchestrated approach. But if you don't have any of those, well, then choreography might be a really good idea for you. Another question to ask yourself is, how much of these less than happy flows do I have? How many of these compensating transactions or compensating flows do I need to support? Because if there are many, and they introduce bidirectional coupling, remember that that's what you're looking for, then, okay, maybe an orchestrated approach is better. Because if you need to compensate, remember, the orchestrator already had access to all of the services that got us to a point. So if we want to undo stuff, we are not introducing additional coupling to undo these, because it already has a connection to them. It's already coupled to them in the same direction. But if you're like, no, I don't have that many, or they don't introduce bidirectional coupling, well, okay, then maybe choreographed approach is for you. Another one to ask yourself, like, do you have a high probability of change? The workflow that you're looking to design, how stable is that thing? Or how well do you understand it? Sometimes it can be super stable, but we don't have access to the business experts that can explain us how the thing works. Have you ever been there? Come on. Yes, thank you. So, if you have a high probability of change, or you're quite insecure about how the thing works, then an orchestrated approach might be a better idea. If that's not the case, well, then choreography might be a better fit. And finally, is there someone responsible for the workflow? This is also an important question to ask. How important is it for you to be able to go to a single team, to a single service to understand what is the state of my workflow? Because if there is a high sense of responsibility, then orchestration gives you that centralized model. If that's less of a concern, well, then a choreographed approach might work well. That's why in retail, you will see that a choreographed approach, it can work perfectly. But there are still so many retail businesses that end up with an oral fulfillment service. The reason is the high responsibility. That's what they're looking for. And having clarity on what you want is really important. So these are the 5 questions. You don't have to remember these. I have all of the resources in my GitHub repo for you to look at them after as well, with a bunch of sub-questions that can help you. But there is one more thing, because there's something that you need to keep in the back of your mind when you're using this mental framework to sort of try to see where you end up. And that is that you need to guard the size of your workflows. Because the thing is that if your workflow is way too big and you use these 5 questions, by definition, you're always going to end up with an orchestrated approach. Because the bigger the workflow, well, the bigger the odds that you have complex prerequisites, the bigger the odds that you have complex compensating flows, and the bigger the odds that there's high responsibility involved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's important that you constantly reevaluate, can I split this thing up? Like, to which level can I start to split things up to make maybe different decisions? And then you start to look at sub-workflows, of which one you're doing orchestration and somewhere else you're doing choreography. And draw. by drawing these things, at least I'm a visual person. And like I started the session, this is about the lines, right? We want to understand how the lines are flowing. So visualize them. By drawing these things, you get a better understanding of what is exactly happening in the system. When you're talking about those compensating flows, what I tend to do is I draw everything in black, the happy flow, and then per alternate flow, I will use a different color and see how much bidirectional coupling that gives me. Visualizing these types of things can give you a lot of clarity. Now, if you've looked into this topic, by now you might be thinking, why is this so complicated? Have you never heard of the rule of thumb, Orchestrate within a service boundary and choreograph across? Who's heard that before? Okay, a couple of hands. Well, generally speaking, I would agree that this is a good guideline, not a rule of thumb, guideline. The reason that I don't like to use this as a rule is, first of all, because it's black and white, and the world is not black and white. But second of all, is because it means that it hides away all of the assumptions that this rule is making. Because what's the underlying assumption of this guideline? That you got the right service boundaries. And how many times have that been true already in your experience? Because not many in mine. That's usually what we tend to get wrong because we don't have enough insight into the domain. That is where our insights progress, and that is fine. Okay? So use those 5 questions, see where you end up, and then reevaluate. Does this make sense? Do I maybe have a boundary issue here? And even when we take care and when we take our time and when we think about all of these questions and all of that, we still end up with changes that we didn't really anticipate. And if that happens, well, you have to accept it. The sooner you accept it, the better. Because if you're like, but it took us such a long time to design this is my baby, that attitude is going to hurt you, because the longer you hold on to a design that is fighting you, the harder it's going to make it. The more of these sort of weird hacks that you're going to start to introduce, because it's just fighting you all the time. So instead, embrace it. Ask yourself, maybe I got a service boundary wrong. Changing that is not going to be easy, right? It usually requires that you talk to multiple teams, and now you have to plan. So in the meantime, if you realize my service boundaries are wrong, it might make sense to actually orchestrate. Forcing choreography, even though it makes sense in the sort of end game, when you know that the boundaries are off, can actually hurt you more. And that brings me to the end. Now, I hope by now I have convinced you that it's not or. It's not orchestration or choreography. It is and the question you should be asking is where and why. There is no wrong or right pattern, because any well-designed distributed system, you will find both coordination mechanisms in different places. So it's important that you keep identifying, when you look at a business workflow, what are the sub-workflows that I'm able to isolate here, and what different decisions am I going to make for each and every one of those sub-workflows. You can use that 5-question framework to help, which you will find in my additional resources. And it's important that you keep reevaluating your service boundaries. It is not a failure when you see new things. I call it progressive insights. We now have a better understanding of how the system should work. It's important, and I keep saying this over and over, that we don't just make decisions, but that we understand why we make them, so that we are also aware of the trade-offs that we are making, so that we know what risks are we exposing ourselves to. And when choices still sort of catch up with you, like these differences and these unexpected changes in the system, well, then reevaluate the choices that you make. And that will help you become a lot more successful at building and maintaining these types of systems. Thank you so much for listening. If you scan the QR code, it will take you to one of my GitHub repos where I have a bunch of additional resources. This is also one of the topics that we deep dive on one of my workshops. I see a couple of familiar faces. Hello again. Hopefully I'll be back at some point to give that again. And if you have any questions, then please come over. I'm happy to hear them. Thank you.